The Winnipeg Jets have quite a few upcoming free agents over the next few years. What does that picture look like for the Jets, and how will it impact their pipeline? Find out on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
Your Locked On Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hi, friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode, we are going to walk through some future casting and talking a little bit about the upcoming few years of Jets hockey, because after this season, Winnipeg has a lot of free agents. This is a big upcoming year. Obviously, one of the biggest players in Jets franchise history is up for renewal. That is going to be an interesting negotiation. And, a lot of other pieces in the Jets depth department might be changing over. So I want to walk through that, talk about which prospects in the pipeline might be the most likely to start filling in for players here over the next couple of seasons. And, ultimately, this Jets team right now, as is on the older side. And I had a bit of a debate online with some folks about, age and speed being factors. And people said, what about the Panthers really aligns with the idea that you need to be younger and faster. And I wanted to chat about why I think the Jets have to maybe approach this model differently and how they can with what they've recently been trying to build both internally and externally. But before we dive into all of that, did want to let you know that today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Download the FanDuel app now by visiting FanDuel.com, and you could win $300 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Now, let's talk about the free agent picture for the Jets, right? Winnipeg's got more than a few free agents coming up over the next couple of years. After this summer, they're going to have 3 defensemen and about 5 or 6 forwards coming up for contract extension, plus a couple of RFAs, right? So the 6 forwards I was referring to are UFAs, and then the 2 RFAs make it 8 total forwards, 3 defenders, 11 total skaters, and, not a ton locked up after that. You've also got Eric Comrie up for extension, which is kind of an interesting question. Do you bring him back? Is he a player that you want to re-sign? Or do you try to go internally for some of your goaltending assistants, right? And, looking at this free agent list, already there's a couple of guys that are going to be coming back. The first one I feel pretty strongly returns is Kyle Connor. Now, his situation's a little more tricky, right? We've talked about it the past couple of weeks. There is still a lot of radio silence about it. And until either Kaprizov or McDavid announce their contracts, I think his camp is inclined to just sit and wait. I saw some of you commenting that, KFC's not worth more than $9.5 million, or he's not getting more than $11 million. And while I may, in theory, agree with how you assess, the player value, and certainly you compare it to Scheifele and Hellebuck's contracts, and he'd be getting more than that, and that doesn't make a lot of logical sense. The way that the league is moving, how his agent's going to look at this, and what Connor's ask is going to be, I would say prepare for sticker shock. I think you're going to be surprised by just how much money he's going to get paid. I know it sounds crazy, and I know you're probably thinking it's not possible, but we've already heard either Friedman or folks from The Athletic float out the fact that they're talking about a $12 million price tag. I continue to think that that's really in the range that we're looking. If it goes a little over that, that would be not ideal for the Jets, but the hope is that the cap continues to go up and that you can sort of absorb some of that cost. But I can tell you right off the bat, prepare yourself for sticker shock. It's coming. I think we're going to see some contracts that, frankly, a lot of folks aren't quite prepared to sort of wrap their minds around, and it's going to be weird. This is a new era of the NHL, and it's partly why I've been telling you, the past couple of seasons, it was really important to make the most of this window, particularly last year. As the revenue and cap continue to go up, this is not going to favor the Jets so much, at least traditionally with how the Jets spend. maybe they adapt to the times and maybe they change their processes and how they think about things. But, free agency is going to be a bit of a pain point for Winnipeg going forward. There's going to be more money spent than I think they're used to. Other free agents include Adam Lowry. Lowry, I think, is probably getting a 3 to 4 year deal. I would think, maybe 4.5 million. I don't know if he's going to get a lot more beyond that. I would probably not want to pay a ton more, even though he is the captain. I think in terms of his on ice impact, that 4.5 million range kind of feels like a relative sweet spot for a few years, especially, if he does start to age out here over the next couple of seasons. You've also got Nyquist, Taves, Pearson, and Koepka. Of those guys, I would say Taves is probably the only one that has any shot of coming back beyond this year, and I wouldn't imagine it to be more than one season. But we'll just have to wait and see, right? This year's kind of like what you might call the beta test for Taves, and to see how his performances upon return to the NHL. He hasn't played in a couple of years. We don't really know his game state or his fitness levels beyond camp and practice. So huge mystery box. Hopefully, the Jets can make it work and find a way to get him back up to speed relatively quickly. You've also got a couple of RFAs here, and Perfetti and Gustafsson. For me, there's only one that I think the Jets really intend to bring back. Gus may come back, as sort of a qualifier sort of thing. But Perfetti, his next deal probably looks to be in the 5.5 to 6.5 range. It's a pretty wide gap, and I think it's really going to depend on what happens this season. His track record is pretty solid. I think right now his track record kind of has him in the 5.5 by 4 to 5 range. But if he has a really big breakout season, you might start thinking about him entering the 6.5 to 7 million by 6 year range. For me, I hope that he does enough to earn a long-term spot. I think a long-term deal for the Jets would be ideal. You get him locked up. He performs well. He continues to be a key part of this core. That would, solve a lot of questions. And, you start to have a little bit more picture clarity for your upcoming salary considerations. Gustafsson, if he's cheap and they qualify him and he takes it, yeah, sure, he'll come back. I'd like to get him signed for a couple of seasons, but I know that Arniel doesn't seem to be that fond of him for some reason, which I suppose I don't quite understand. But it is what it is. On the defensive side, you've got Shen, Miller, and Stanley. The only guy that I could see the Jets bringing back is maybe Stanley. They may already trade one of these guys at some point this season. Stanley would probably come back on a very similar deal, 1.25, maybe 1 or even 1.5 million. Not cheap, mind you, but they seem to love him. They play him a lot. So, yeah, wouldn't be shocked if Logan is the one who returns. But they do need to open up some roster spots for some of these young players like Salamonson, because, at some point, the Jets can't have 30,000 defenders on the team and no spots for rookies. It's just not going to be a great conducive environment to getting your kids up to NHL speed. Comrie might be one of the last interesting free agents to figure out. I think you probably look at him more as maybe somebody who's let go after the season. If you do bring him back, it's only for one more year. But beyond this, I think you want one of Milic or DiVincentis to really take that role and become your future player as Hully's backup. Beyond this, most players have at least another season or so of term. Niederreiter will expire in about 2 years. You've got Iafallo, who just re-signed. Nemesnikov's got another year after this. Barron does too. Barron just re-signing. The next real big, I guess, free agent period is probably the summer after, the 27-28 season. You'll have some bigger questions to answer as Morrissey, Sandberg, and DeMello are now up for renewal, but, it's a couple of years away, so we'll think about that when the time rolls around. Let's not get too ahead of ourselves. We've still got plenty of work to do in the upcoming season. Now, as far as the future is concerned, which Jets prospects are likely to start filling in and actually helping out in the next season or two, and when can we expect some of the longer-term prospects? We'll find out coming right up in just a brief moment, but before we do, did want to let you know about our friends and partners at Monarch Money. Most people can't name all their financial accounts or even what they're worth. Whether it's 401ks, properties, or investments, if you don't have the full picture, you can end up leaving money on the table. That's why Monarch Money is here to help. It's an all-in-one personal finance tool that brings your entire financial life together in one clean, easy-to-use interface on your laptop or your phone. Monarch Money is built for people with busy lives. If you've put off organizing your finances, Monarch is here to do the heavy lifting for you. You can link all your accounts in one spot and see clear data visuals, get smart categorization of spending, and finally feel in control of your money without ever touching a spreadsheet. They also have shared accounts, so if you have maybe a partner or a spouse and you want to stay on the same page, you can have that. It'll also allow you to set financial goals and make sure that you're meeting them, especially when paired with their expenditure tracking, and they can help you manage things like, maybe cutting down on some of the streaming services you're spending just a few too many dollars on. Don't let financial opportunity slip through the cracks. Use code LOCKEDONNHL at monarchmoney.com in your browser for half off your first year. That's 50% off your first year at monarchmoney.com with code LOCKEDONNHL. Hey, friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us in tonight's episode as we are just chatting a little bit about, some of the Jets prospects, when we can expect to see them actually make an NHL impact, and, what the timeline is for sort of turning over this Jets core. Winnipeg is kind of approaching a point here where, they have a lot of free agents after the next 2 seasons. And that leaves opportunities for Winnipeg to bring in some young talent. It also leaves the Jets a little vulnerable in some stages as they try to navigate this potential moment where they've got a lot of roster spaces and maybe not a clear picture of some of these prospects. But of course, the easy names to kind of circle for the next season, partly this year, probably more like next year. Lambert, obviously Chibrikov, and probably Salamonson. I think Salamonson will get some ice time next season. Will it be a lot? Probably not. I think Lambert and Chibrikov are likely to get a fair bit of time, assuming both are still here and haven't been traded. I would think next year's probably the timeline for both of them to see significant NHL action. When it comes to maybe like a Braden Yeager or a Barlow, I would say maybe the season after that, probably 2 years down the road. Barlow, I think, will have some development work to do with the Moose for a year or two before I would say you'd really start to see him. And again, this is assuming that the Jets don't trade him. He might be a prospect that Winnipeg feels somewhat comfortable letting go. I don't think Barlow is super highly thought of in the org as like an untouchable player. I think he's well liked, and I think they enjoy his development track. But I think compared to maybe like the Salomonsons, who are almost untouchable, Barlow might be a player that is thought to help bring in some more immediate assistance. You think about a Yeager. Yeager has probably the most potential to jump in faster over like a Barlow. I think Braden already has some NHL talent, and certainly in terms of the way that he thinks the game, how he approaches his work ethic, the two-way commitment, the defensive work, all that stuff to me is more pro-ready than maybe some of his peers. But of course, the Jets will probably, slow play this a little bit. They'll give him a year with the Moose. They'll see how he does. If he really, really impresses and just knocks the lights off of everything, you might see him in the NHL a little bit sooner. I've said he'll probably get an NHL debut of some sort, either this season or early next. I think it's coming soon, but I just don't know how quickly Winnipeg feels comfortable with Yeager's progress. Again, I think he's further along in some ways, but the offensive production and stuff, I think you want to see maybe hit that next level. Fabian Wagner, I think Wagner could be an interesting one in about 2 seasons. He still seems a little bit raw. He's not the flashiest, high-end, most elite player, but what I think he will bring is some real spark to your bottom 6, and I think he could do that for several years for the Jets. But I think Winnipeg will probably want to see what he does this season, because this past year he kind of had, a really quiet season, not much action, not much production, and then for a couple of weeks he started shooting the lights out. And I think the Jets will want to see how real is this offensive production. Towards the end of the season, it looked like he was still putting up a decent number of points, but it wasn't like crazy high-level elite production, so they might be pumping the brakes just a bit and waiting to see how all of this goes. If there's one guy that I've also kind of got maybe as a sleeper for your fourth line, I'm kind of thinking about Jacob Julien. Julien has sort of floated around as a player I've talked about whose stock has definitely taken a dip with the Jets. I think Julian will probably be about 2 years away, is my guess. But I think he already has, in some ways, some pro-ready habits in terms of the defensive aspect. I thought it showed up in preseason and camp last year. We'll have to see how he does this year. Obviously, the offensive numbers with London really didn't jump off the page this season, but that's not the only way that he can contribute. So I wouldn't really write him off yet, but I think he's probably a little bit of a longer shot to be, a higher impact NHLer. I think, yes, he had a big season a couple years ago. Things fell off last season, and there's question about his ceiling and what he can actually do. But I think we've seen some stuff at the pro camps where I'm like, yeah, he's projectable. I think he does fit what the Jets will want. The defensive picture is a little bit more complicated. For Winnipeg, there's only one guy that's really imminent, and that's Salamonson. I'd say he's probably a year away from more routine duty. Everyone else, you look at like an Alphonse Frey. I think some people really like Tyrell Bauer. There's Sacha Boumedienne. So Bauer, I would say, is not likely to get NHL duty at all. I think he's a really good enforcer for the Moose and can kind of protect some of the kids. But unfortunately, some of the skating and stuff doesn't translate necessarily to more NHL duty. I think some folks were kind of hoping that he could kind of have maybe a Logan Stanley curve. I think with Bauer, his game is a bit more limited. He's a very physical presence, and he'll drop the gloves and protect some of the youth. And so I think in that respect, his value might really be with Manitoba. For the other guys, Boumedienne and Frey's going to be probably 2 to 3 years away. Boumedienne's probably in a similar camp, 2 to 3 seasons away, maybe a little bit longer. You also kind of have to account for how his college career goes and what he decides to do along the way. So, I think the Jets' blue line doesn't have a lot of imminent help. Not that they necessarily need a ton right now. I think that they're actually almost flush with pro defenders with a big club. But for the pipeline, you look at it and there's not as much there that I think projects to be NHL ready talent anytime soon. Boumedienne might adapt to the pro leagues very fast after he leaves college. That could be a really big boost to the Jets. Frey might be a really fun puck mover, but again, these guys are probably not within the next couple of years, a bit further out. And so I'm just not expecting them to be playing much of a role with the core until, maybe we start to see a little more turnover in a few years. Elsewhere, you've got some other prospects who are going to be floating around. Kevin, he's probably 2 to 3 years away. I think he, after this season with Niagara, he'll turn pro, he'll come over. I would expect the Jets to try and get him into the NHL sooner than later. I think that they suspect his pro-ready habits, his offensive motor, and sort of the leadership to be really valuable. And, maybe he'll spend a year or two with the Moose, but I think Winnipeg would love for him to start really ramping up quickly in the pros, doing well, finding early success, and earning a quick call-up. Again, probably 2-ish years away, but he could be somebody that, as the Jets hopefully start to phase more kids in and, develop this core built around a really strong foundation of veterans like Scheifele and Hellebuck, that they can add at the perimeter some of these guys who, maybe are not ready for like top 6 minutes yet, but could start to chip away with some depth deployments. So there's some real exciting stuff there. I do have some time for guys like, Garrett Brown and Parker Ford. Brown, I think, is really a real sleeper in the system. And I didn't mention him on yesterday's episode, sort of talking about prospects to watch. I think Brown could be a really intriguing one in about 2 years for the Jets. He's, a strong puck mover. He's defensively very responsible. Denver trusts him a good bit. So keep an eye out for him. Ford obviously has done really well in limited minutes with the Jets, and he's been, impressive with the Moose. He could also be fighting for a fourth line spot as early as this coming season, maybe next year. I think he'll probably would be one of those guys that's sort of in the Axel Janssen-Fjällby category of being like a tweener. But personally, I think he's got some pro level talent. I think he should be with the Jets. I think he could, be really fun on the fourth line. But as of right now, there's a lot of competition, a lot of veterans vying for spots. So you may not see him this year, but next year maybe as some of these free agents head out, maybe Winnipeg starts welcoming in more kids like this, not only to save some money, but also get the Jets faster, a little bit younger, and a little bit more exciting. Speaking of younger and faster, I want to chat about the implications of why this is probably more important for the Jets than it is other teams, and why teams like, say, the Florida Panthers don't necessarily have to follow the young and fast model. We'll chat about that coming right up. But before we do, wanted to shout out our friends and partners at FanDuel. The NFL season is here, and FanDuel is making sure you're ready with kickoff with a can't-miss offer. Right now, new customers can bet just $5, and if your bet wins, you'll get $300 in bonus bets to use across the app. Maybe you were inspired by this weekend of NFL action. Lots of big comebacks, whether you're a Bills or a Vikings fan. You saw some crazy stuff the past couple of days. For me as a Ravens fan, I prefer to pretend football doesn't exist. But you know what? Maybe you think you know who's going to win this upcoming weekend. Maybe you want to put some money down on Minnesota continuing its comeback form with J.J. McCarthy, or you think that maybe the Chiefs are going to have a big season. Whatever it is, the only way to get on the action is to download the FanDuel app now by visiting FanDuel.com to get started. That's FanDuel.com to place your first $5 bet, and if that $5 bet wins, you'll get $300 in bonus bets to keep your winning streaks alive. Hey friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Everydayers, thank you so much for rejoining us in tonight's episode, as we're just chatting a little bit about the importance of the Jets, maybe starting to get younger and faster over the next couple of years. I got into some debates on social media yesterday about kind of Winnipeg being, older and slower this season, and the natural pushback that I get is, well, Winnipeg's been first and fourth in the past couple of seasons. They had a much better playoff run this past year. Their roster looks relatively similar on paper to what it was, under the first real Arneal season. Why are we suggesting that this team is too slow, too old now, and why is it a problem, right? Look at the Florida Panthers. How does older and slower really apply, in comparison? Because that team is not exactly young, and they don't have like loads and loads of speed. And I get some of that sentiment, and where I think the argument doesn't really hold a lot of water for me is just look at the kinds of talent a team like Florida has. Barkov, Reinhart, Lundell, Marchand, Luostarinen. They've got tons of players up and down that team that, don't have to be the world's speediest players, but up here, they're brilliant. You have high IQ players who are very productive in limited minutes, or in some cases, very big minutes, and they have tons of them, right? That top nine is like one of the most elite top nines in the whole league, maybe the most elite top nine in the league. Their defense doesn't have tons of like incredible talent, but you've got a couple of key top end puck movers and guys like Gustav Forsling, and then you have solid depth in players like Kulikov, decent contributors. And where I think a team like the Jets have to approach things differently is for Winnipeg. They are so much slower than some of their opponents that for them it'd be more just coming up to where a lot of the league is. Speed is not the only thing. Age is not the only thing. You can be older and slower and still be really gifted and productive. Just look at Anze Kopitar. But I think for the Jets, the biggest reason that I stress younger and faster is it can help you maybe compensate a little bit for some of the skill, right? The Jets don't have the deepest roster when it comes to a lot of elite offensive talent. They just don't. And so the only way that you can really sort of work around that is to try and build, four lines that are mobile, that are quick, and that can pressure and overwhelm you in ways that maybe you can sort of paper over the lack of elite individual skill. You've got a couple of guys who super lead the way, like Scheifele. You've got Connor. You've got Hellebuck and Morrissey, of course. Sandberg's fantastic, but with Velarde too just recently joining. But beyond that, you look at the team, and there's not as much immediate offensive high-end talent up and down the team. And that's not necessarily an indictment of the roster, but I think it's just a reality that the Jets are kind of dealing with right now. And as opponents in the playoffs continue to, change their own rosters, many of them add good skating skill, many of them add elite offensive tools. The Jets are going to have to find ways to try and work around that encounter. And that's where I think a lot of their prospect development and drafting has improved, at least on paper. You look at who they're drafting, you look at what they're drafting, and these guys are all pretty gifted skaters. They at least have NHL caliber, higher end speed, which again, it's not the only thing, but they pair that with industrious motors. The Jets are looking for guys who constantly create on and off the puck. I think that that's a very conscious decision because the Jets know that they might not have, the McDavids or the Matthews or whatever of the world. But what they can have is a four-line team that pressures you, that harasses you, that forces you into mistakes, and that can win more as a stronger whole than individual units. I think that, the Jets have kind of had to do things differently than a lot of other teams. And sometimes I think they also self-inflict maybe a few wounds. I think the past trade deadline felt like Winnipeg really put its eggs in the Nelson basket. And when that didn't work, they sort of ran out of options and tried to do some stopgap stuff. But I think if you look internally, you've got some real interesting options for the coming years that can help turn this team over and make it not only younger and faster, but also kind of alleviate some of the pressure on the top six to be, the absolute breadwinners. Sometimes I think Winnipeg is still a little bit stuck in terms of their matchup mindset. And I think, having more flexibility, having more speed and skill that can make faster decisions, that can be, relentless around the goal mouth. I think that stuff could make a really positive impact on how this team creates offense, how productive they are, and how likely they are to go deeper in the playoffs. That's really what it's all about, is raising this playoff ceiling, getting this team to be in a more competitive state, because we know that they're masters of the regular season, but it's the playoffs where this team has had issues. When the Blues almost stonewalled Winnipeg and made life really hard when the Jets were on the road, Winnipeg didn't have as many easy answers. And maybe some of these kids, should that series have happened in the future, maybe those prospects who hopefully become NHLers by then would have, tipped that balance. Maybe it would have moved the scale a little bit more. Maybe it would have made life easier instead of forcing, all the way to a game 7. So it's an interesting conversation for the Jets. This is going to be a couple of years where I don't know that the Jets really want to transition, but they might be forced into it. Maybe they try and prolong this core as long as humanly possible. They really hate the idea of losing revenue. So any sort of loss of cash is not really going to be acceptable to the team. But hey, we're entering new eras of the league, new eras of the Jets, and I'm hoping that, maybe they've taken a few lessons from what's happened before and they can try and improve from there. But curious to know your thoughts there. Drop your suggestions and comments below or at my social medias at HLivingLoco and at @LO_Winnipeg Jets. For tonight's episode, though, that's going to be all the time that we have. Thank you so much for listening. As we head into the final couple of days before the Prospect Showdown, we'll chat a little bit about, maybe some hopes for that, what I'm looking for with some of these kids, and all of the exciting prospect talk about maybe some of the bigger players in this pool heading into this upcoming season. But for tonight's show, that's all the time that we have. Thanks for listening. Have a great night. And as always, go Jets go.